Welcome back, life science learners, to the next segment of our lesson today. We've been looking at ecological pyramids, we've been looking at energy flow in an ecosystem, and now we're going to spend some time looking at what are different trophic levels and what do we mean by the concept of biomass. It's important that we recognize that when we talk of ecosystems, that energy flows in food chains. We often refer to the term as trophic levels. So let's try and understand the concept of what is a trophic level. So the concept of a trophic level is that the trophic level of an organism is the position that it occupies in a food web. So often we find that food webs illustrate different food chains. And as I mentioned, in a food chain, sometimes an organism would occupy a specific role. Example, it would be a secondary consumer or a tertiary consumer. However, that position may change in a complicated food web, where sometimes a primary producer could become a primary consumer or secondary consumer. So let's look at what trophic levels mean. The trophic level of an organism is the position it occupies in a food web. So essentially, when we talk of trophic levels, we refer to the position an individual occupies. When we look at food chains, we often see producers, consumers, either being primary, secondary, or tertiary. However, we mentioned that when we see different food chains interconnected in a food web, often the position of an organism may vary when we put them into a trophic level. So let's try and understand what trophic level means. So as I mentioned, a food chain is a succession of organisms that eat other organisms and may, in turn, be eaten themselves. So we see that the roles and positions may vary as we look at them being producers, consumers, or even secondary consumers. This means that the trophic level of an organism is the number of steps it is from the start of the food chain. Let's try and understand what that means. So, the position of an organism occupies within a feeding sequence is known as its trophic level. So, if we find that it is a primary consumer, we tend to put that as trophic level 1. If we find it being a tertiary consumer, then we put that at trophic level 3 or even sometimes level 4. So it's important that we understand where they are. What's important to note is that producers are always occupying the first trophic level, as these are the autotrophs in terms of the feeding sequence. They are the primary producers that produce the energy and will always be at the first trophic level. Primary consumers feed on other producers and hence occupy the second trophic level, so we call them primary consumers, taking up the second trophic level. Your other consumers, which we refer to as your secondary consumers and tertiary consumers, may occupy the subsequent trophic levels based on where they feed. And that takes us to this illustration, where we see that the first trophic level are your producers, which are then made up of your autotrophs. Examples would be your plants and those that are able to trap energy from the sun. Those individuals that consume the producers are called your primary consumers, and they make up the second trophic level. Subsequently, we know that secondary consumers that feed off your primary consumers become the third trophic level, and those tertiary consumers that feed off your secondary consumers are now recognized as the fourth trophic level. So we see that this level of trophic organization points to the position an individual occupies from the start of the food chain. So that's in relation to the first step. It's important that we understand what energy efficiency is. Let's try and understand what that means. So when energy transformation takes place in living organisms, the process is never 100% efficient. So it means that when an individual or an organism consumes another organism, it is not accessing 100% of that. So we say that there is some reduction in the energy available on consumption. So most of that energy, we said, is lost to the organism, either used by a process called respiration, released as heat, or excreted in feces, or it's unconsumed. Typically, energy transformations are approximately 10% efficient, with about 90% of that available energy being lost between trophic levels. This means that the amount of energy transferred depends on how efficient an organism can capture and use the energy. It's usually between 5 to 20% of that energy being used by the organism. The amount of energy transferred depends on how efficient organisms can capture and use that energy. And we've mentioned that a large amount is lost between trophic levels. And these, again, is used by the energy, by the organism. Some of it is stored as carbon compounds, and some of it leads to the accumulation of biomass at a trophic level. So what is the concept of biomass? It's important that we recognize this, because in our next segment, when we talk of energy pyramids, we also talk about a pyramid which we refer to as a biomass pyramid. Let's try and understand the concept of what biomass is. Biomass is the total mass of a group of organisms, and this consists of the carbon compounds contained in the cells and the tissue. Because carbon compounds store energy, scientists can measure the amount of energy added to the organisms as biomass. So essentially it refers to the buildup of the carbohydrates or the organic compounds in an organism at each trophic level, which essentially is the biomass measured. What's important to recognize is that biomass diminishes along the food chain with the loss of carbon dioxide, water, and waste products taking up that energy. Because energy and biomass is lost between each level of food chains, the amount and the number of potential trophic levels are limited. So as we see greater loss in energy, we will see that the number of trophic levels significantly reduce. So we understand that the more energy available in an ecosystem or in a food chain, the greater the complexity and the levels of trophic levels present. So essentially, the greater the number of trophic levels would mean that there's more energy available to sustain a higher level of organisms in that food chain. So guys, in this segment, we've looked at energy flow, we've looked at biomass as a concept, and we've looked at placing organisms at trophic levels. Let's have a short break, and I'll see you in a bit.